And then if we come in here, got the seal installed on this side as well. This side's a little bit harder, but there's a teeny tiny lip in there, and you can use the same install tool as on the driver's side. And I put it flush with that lip because that's kind of what it looked like when I pulled it out. So I think that looks good. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Zach, and here we talk about overlanding, gear, builds, DIY, all sorts of stuff related to modifying your vehicle. And today we're going to be diving into part 3 of the long travel build. So if you aren't familiar or you haven't seen the previous videos, I'll link them up here, up at the top of the screen. But basically, Dirt King came out with a 2-inch long travel kit. When they say 2-inch, that means 2 inches wider on each side. And so some people will just think that that has to do with a lift, but it actually has to do with the width. So it kind of changes your stance of your vehicle. And what it does is it allows for a wider arc. So with your suspension, it might not push too much farther, but since it's wider, it causes a larger arc. So arc length maybe. Anyways, this 2-inch long travel kit has sealed ball joints, which is why I call it a daily driver long travel kit. Also, instead of having like Heim pivot points on the frame, it's got rubber. So it's just got a lot of benefits that keep it a little lower maintenance than your typical long travel kit. So that's why I call it kind of a daily driver long travel kit. And I'm also running the Dobinsons suspension with it because I feel like Dobinsons tends to lean towards rubber. And so most of their components tend to be a little bit lower maintenance as well. So that's why I'm kind of calling this the lower maintenance or daily drivable friendly long travel kit, because a lot of guys will run setups with spherical bearings and only Heims, and it just will cause a lot more squeaking and more things that need to be monitored. And especially if you live in the Rust Belt like me, up here in the Midwest, we get a lot of salt and dirt and grime and stuff through the winter. That just wreaks havoc on those spherical bearings or the Heims. We'll have to see how the setup stands through the winter, but I'm pretty confident it's going to be a lot better than most of the other long travel options out there. So if you're trying to get a long travel kit, this may be a way to do it, especially if you want to do snow wheeling. So that's essentially kind of a long-winded intro, but basically what ended up happening is in part 1, I ended with talking about putting in the needle bearing delete and new seals because it's kind of what we got to do at this point. So all of the frame welding has been put on, all of the arms are on, and in this video we're going to talk about stuff I needed to fix on the suspension and on those seals. So once we've got the arms on now, we can put in the seals, the CV axles, and the suspension, and then that allows us to put the spindles back on, and we're almost done with this install. So there's going to be a part 4 to this series, so don't assume that this is the last video and wonder why it kind of ended funny. So yeah, what we're going to do first is we're going to jump into the seals. Installing these seals was a little bit more convoluted than I thought. You're really going to want a caliper because you have to measure these depths pretty precisely. And I'm pretty confident that nothing's leaking now, so that's great. Essentially, everything looks good, and the approach I made was a good one. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to install those seals. I'm going to kind of walk you through how I did it. So with those seals, you got to really work around their circumference and make sure they're the proper depth. And so you got to use a caliper and measure as you go. It's a bit of a putsy process, but I think a company or a dealership would charge quite a bit to do this job. So I'm kind of happy to save the money at least. So, all right, we're going to install the seals. Then we're going to jump into unboxing the suspension. I'm going to show you some things about it, some of the improvements or at least upgrades from the standard MRR setup for 4Runners. And then we're going to get it installed on the kit, and I'll kind of show you some of the intricacies and things you got to think about if you want to use these strut assemblies with this long travel kit. So, all right, well, let's jump right into it. And before my hands get grease on them again, I just want to show you these part numbers here. So the 47026 is the passenger side. This 47027 is the driver side. Passenger side is larger than the driver side. And you can see here, these two look very similar. So we'll take this out of its packaging. I've started buying OEM parts on eBay because there's typically some seller who's about the same price as these discounted dealerships, but they'll actually ship out and get to you within a week, unlike the dealerships. So that's been my tactic lately. And here's the crazy thing, the East Coast Gear Supply seal install tool Works just as good for the passenger side as the driver's side because this little lip is the same size for both sides. The passenger side just has a larger flange to hit on, so it's even better. So that is the driver's side, and this works for it too. But yeah, pretty handy. So, all right, we're gonna grab the new seal, which, you know, stacks nicely and everything you'd want it to. And we got to put some Diff oil on the outside here and then start hammering it in slowly but surely to get this placed in the right spot. All right, here we go. All right, so I'm going to show a couple of things here. First thing I want to show is look at how clean this cover is. I don't feel like there was any rubbing on this, and if so, it was minimal. And it seems like it did a pretty good job, or it didn't rub at all, and that's why there's like 0 black marks or anything. So this is on the passenger side. Now I'm gonna crawl under here and show it to you. I'm trying to show this as best as I can. So here is just the seal head on. So I'm gonna take some different angles because I don't think this is actually that helpful. But you can see that there's like this outer seal. So you can see there's like this outer lip, and then there's that inner lip. And everything I read says that that inner lip is what's important. So then if we take a different angle here, if we go from this angle, you can see how it looks like my seal is slightly past that. So I have a feeling that my seal is just slightly too deep. So if you look at some of these angles. So that's what I'm gonna try and do. And also, when I put my seals in, I didn't put any Diff fluid on them. So I'm also wondering if there's kind of like micro scratching that occurred on this rubber. But there you go. And this, that looks like dirt or grime of some kind. I don't know, I don't like how that looks. But I just want to show this vantage point. So we are on the passenger side. I'm gonna pull this Diff seal out and show it next to the new one and the part number before I take it out of the packaging so that we can actually reference that. So, all right, let's pull this out. Essentially that inner lip looks to be 5.5 inches. So you can see mine is too deep. Okay, so I just took all of this, kind of cleaned out and got it to a point where I think it's pretty good and ready for the seal. So this shows that inner lip really nicely. And then you can see inside even farther, there's a snap ring, and some people talk about that in the forums. All right, so basically what I did is I got some 15 grit sandpaper and I tried to knock down that edge of rust as best as I could. So let me grab my piece of sandpaper I was ripping up. So I'd come right in here, past there, and try and just take that off ever so slightly. There's a guy who did a write-up and some other people who use like a wire brush in there, and I just don't know if that's too abrasive on that inner surface. I'm just trying to keep this rust down so that it doesn't interfere with putting in the seal. I don't necessarily care that it's actually there. You know, maybe I should remove it all, but in some regards, it's maybe too late after all that pitting. So I'm just trying to not cause any damage to the seals and keep that out of the way. So that's the plan. If this leaks again, then we will be back for another round. There's some clean fluid just kind of sitting right in there. So I'll probably grab that to kind of lube up that area. And then we're going to start tapping in the new seal. And basically this new seal, I'm going to try and seat 5.3 or so millimeters in, so about flush with that inner circle. And I'm going to go around and I'm going to measure the whole way around with my caliper to make sure that I'm actually achieving that depth. So yeah, time to start doing that. All right, well, I think I got everything installed correctly here, and I think that is placed about where we want it. So it's hard to tell from this angle, but it's essentially flush with the top of this lip. That little lip in there also seems a little bit slanted. It's a little tricky also to measure the depth here because the rust adds like a tiny bit. So what I did is I tried to measure about 5 millimeters, you know, I don't know, 5 millimeters conservatively, because the manual I found said this side is supposed to be 4.8 to 5.8 millimeters. So essentially, I think you have about 1 millimeter of wave through this to like kind of give you for buffer. So that's what I tried to do. I think it looks pretty good. I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic that this is gonna work. So this looks good to me. Now I'm gonna go to the other side and start working on the other seal. In all honesty, this side should be easier to do because I have the tool from East Coast Gear Supply, so it's a little ridiculous that I had issues getting this one on. But what I'm gonna do is make sure I clean up this edge in here a little bit with maybe some sandpaper. I've heard of people using really fine grit sandpaper to clean off that edge so it doesn't rust or rip or catch the seal at all. So I don't know, that's maybe something I'll try. But first we got to get these seals popped out, and then we'll inspect that ledge and see if we need to do anything. So we don't want to scratch that material because that might just be a permanent leaking point. So I have to be very careful. And now we're on the driver's side, and this side I think wasn't hammered in deep enough. So we've got some like black residue going on here, and I actually had a feeling this would happen on this side. So the seal didn't seat quite properly, and I just let it go. So you can kind of see up there how that like bubbled. So that's not good. From this angle, you can kind of see how it just barely protrudes. I think that's like where it landed after it rubbed off. So we'll have to see. I think this seal wasn't fully inserted. So there was a lot of this lip that got rubbed down, and you could hear a squealing noise on this side. And I just thought maybe it would beat itself into submission, but it did not. So that's the situation. And then, sorry, I'm all over the place here. I'm laying on my back. Okay, so this side should be a little bit easier to do because essentially all we have to do is bottom out the seal in here, and that should be doable with the tool we have because it spans this gap here. So it'll push on the seal and it'll bottom out on that metal at the same time. So I'm not too worried about the depth. We just have to get that in there flush. So now what we have to do is, this really I think has a pretty bad lip. Might be worse than the other side. So I'm gonna try and clean that out the best I can. And I wanted to try and show some of this. There you go. Before I clean it. So, all right, so we got the new seal installed. Everything went in smooth. The side that's on kind of this side, it's a little bit harder to hammer, so I had to go pretty slow just to get this one in as well, but everything is looking pretty good. Looks like a little like speck of dirt or something inside there. But I like how this is. I hammered and tried to put it as flush as possible. This side seems to stick out a teeny bit farther than the other side, so I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. I'm almost wondering if the East Coast Gear Supply, like, they should know how to install this correctly. So I can't doubt them, but it feels like this should maybe be just slightly deeper, but hard to say. So anyways, this looks pretty good to me. I've got this done now. So both sides, the seals are in, and I put in the drain bolt on the diff, and we've also got the actuator in and the new gasket setting. So I'm gonna wait 24 hours before I fill this, but I think I'm gonna push in the two CV axles and just see if they spin freely. So that'll be a nice test. So that's what we're gonna do. But yeah, we're making progress getting this back together. So next up, putting in the CV axles. All right, so it just barely doesn't fit on screen. Let's see if I can at least capture the whole shock on screen. So this is what comes in the packaging. Right here, we've got the mounting setup, which they send like a more generic mounting setup with these spacers and pipe clamps. A lot of people put heat shrink over the pipe clamps, so you could do that, and that kind of keeps the reservoir paint nice. Right up here, we have our upper shock tower mount. We've got 2 plates. I haven't fully figured out how these work, but basically it looks like these plates have slightly different thicknesses, so depending upon how thick you need to run, these are a little spacer. So you put these on the very top, you bolt these to the top hat location, and then we're going to be putting, whatever it is here, we're gonna mount this there. So this is just, depends how much extra space you might need, and I'll show you that in a second here. Here's some hardware. We'll go through all this in the install, a little more hardware. I will say these are quite a bit more beefy than the other MRR shocks that I have for my front OEM kind of lift. I'll show you that in a second. So here is the top of the shock tower. Sorry, it's a little heavy. But these spacers then go up on the top of here and provide clearance for that to pivot. So it just depends on how your the upper part of your shock tower is set up and how much space you've got for clearance. I gotta look into the instructions on how to use those correctly. And they've already adjusted these for me according to my setup. So I'll kind of explain that when I kind of do a bit of a walk around with the setup, but I'll throw up on the screen if there's any particular adjustments they've made to this and the particular spring rate of this spring. So far, they only come in the teal configuration for the spring. One thing to note too that I think is pretty sweet is now you get these finned reservoirs. I just love the look of finned reservoirs. And then another thing about Dobinson that people really like to talk about is these bolts and how much adjustability they have for mounting. Even though these are included with a mount, I'm going to be using a Dirt King remote reservoir mount because that will allow me to mount these down kind of where you see a lot of people mounting their reservoirs on Tacomas and Raptors and those sorts of trucks. So I think that's gonna be pretty sweet. I'm looking forward to that. So that's what this shock looks like. I'm just gonna grab my MRR shock and put it next to it and just to show the size difference, which I think is pretty crazy. Before we compare the reservoirs, I'm just gonna compare the actual shocks themselves because the wide angle on my camera distorts the sizing just a little bit, so I want to get them kind of as close to each other as we can. But you can see just how different the diameters are, which I think is pretty cool. My understanding is the threaded body is really the part that matters, and these are like 2.25-ish for this threaded portion, or even looking here in the center portion. That threaded portion is, yeah, about 2.25 thick. But then if we look up here at this threaded portion on this shock body, it's kind of hard to get my tape measure in there. But these are over 2.5, probably 2 3/4, if I had to guess. So the shock body itself is about a 1/2 inch thicker. And then if we spin this around here, just so you can compare the difference between the reservoirs, try and line up the purple dials as best as I can. I think the hose is actually thicker too, which might allow for some either more durability or better fluid transfer. But you can see here that the reservoir itself is about 2 inches shorter, and then this diameter on this reservoir is 2 1/4, and this diameter of this reservoir, including the fins, is 2.5. So They might be roughly around the same size diameter, but this one is a lot longer because this one doesn't have the fins. The depth of the fins here is about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit deeper. Sometimes I think the measurements on these shocks might not be the most precise inch measurements because maybe they go by millimeters. Another thing I'll note is these springs are looking a little rough. And that's just due to the fact that as you drive, rocks will get bounced up and hit the paint on these springs, and then once you're in Minnesota and there's salt on the roads and other moisture, they start to really beat up the springs. So it is what it is, but that's why these look so rough, because they're really not super old. They're pretty decent still. So anyway, that's the suspension and what comes in the box with one of these 8-inch stroke long travel spec'd Dobinson shocks. So I'm really excited to get these installed on the truck. This whole setup is just going to be so sweet. I'm really getting excited. All right, well, we've gotten to the stage here where we're going to start putting all of the suspension on. So this is pretty exciting. I'll put the model numbers for the springs and the actual suspension shock on the screen. But when I was measuring out everything, I was kind of talking about those numbers on the bench. So go check that part out of the video if you're curious on kind of the size of each body. But in the actual box itself, I kind of breezed over the hardware when I was just doing a little top down. But we're going to use the longer bolts here so we can use both of these spacers. And basically, you won't use those spacers if you're maybe using these on like a 3rd gen or a 4th gen. There's a little bit of hardware that's shared or swapped between depending upon the 4Runner. So like over here, we have the shorter version of these bolts, and you may use these for your application. So just to give you a little peek so far, we've got the arms on, and we've got one shock assembly bolted up here. Reservoir is going to fit there real nice, starting to come together. And then we've got the little 2-inch extensions for the tie rod ends. I'm going to be using the same bump stop. You can see that there's this plate, and that's where the bump stop's going to hit. So the arms are pretty obviously passenger and driver, but they have labeled them in spots too, which is pretty nice. But yeah, it's really starting to come together, and I'm liking the teal. The teal is really popping. So all right, well, let's keep on doing some install. I'll show you the other side real quick because I've got the spindle on, and you can sort of see what it looks like without the shock. All right, well, this side is a little less assembled, but just to show you kind of what these arms look like. Try and get over here. Slightly different angle here. It's coming together. Before too long, these are going to be back put together, so really excited. We're really making some good progress. So once we've tested the full compression, and now once we get the shocks in on both sides with the spindles on, we'll know kind of what full droop is. And then we're going to lift up everything about 1/2 inch to try and account for stretch in the limit straps. And then that will allow us to set the point where we want to put the limit strap on the frame. And that's going to go, somewhere back in here, because that is the bolt for our limit strap. And then we're also going to figure out where on the frame we're going to want to put our reservoir mount, because it's going to go right up there. So things are coming together, starting to look pretty sweet. We just got to keep on moving. All right, well, let's get these shocks fully installed here and then start mocking up where the limit straps are going to go. All right, so I feel like I've got everything to a pretty good spot. We've got the limit straps in. Basically what I ended up needing to do is I actually had to set my limit straps differently because I'm doing a bit of prototyping here while also installing everything. So one thing I discovered was these coilovers are 0.75 inches longer than spec for the Dirt King. So the Dirt King 2-inch long travel kit can only tolerate up to a 23-inch shock, I believe. And these are 23 inches and 3/4. And so basically, that's kind of an issue when it comes to setting all of this up and not hurting the ball joints. So I replaced both my ball joints on the upper control arms just to make sure they work.
One thing I was just gonna show you all is all you do is remove a snap ring that's on a little like groove inside of here. Once you pull those out, these will press out up the top, and that's how you remove them. It's actually a pretty easy process, but I'd never done it before. So we got those pulled out. What a lot of people do, I think, is like estimate around a 1/2 inch of stretch on these, but you could always ask Dirt King what they recommend for the stretch. So what you'll do is you take your arms and then you raise them the amount of stretch, place your mount for your limit strap on the frame so that once you let it out, it's going to stretch that and it's going to go 1/2 inch down or whatever you estimate. So that's what you typically do, but I ended up needing to use that to take out some of the length of my coilover so that at max droop, this is going to be only 27 inches long instead of like 27 3/4. So that should be all good to go. This is all going to get removed at some point if I do a bypass here. So we'll have to move that limit strap mount somewhere else. So that's just how it goes for now.
And we got the reservoir mounts installed, and these are a little tricky because the Dirt King plates are designed to try and use some OEM holes, and also we had kind of built our own frame plates, so we covered up those holes and we knew we were doing that. And they also are designed to kind of have the reservoir hang down here a bit, but I'm trying to preserve my sway bar because I may try and run a sway bar, so just trying to leave some flexibility in here. One thing I need to monitor is this hose. It gets really close to this arm, and so I'm going to need to monitor this and maybe put a couple hose P-clamps in here to really pull this in tight next to the shock tower. So we've got everything installed for the time being, and now it's just going to be about monitoring it.
All right, well, we got everything installed. One thing I didn't mention in the suspension install, but I think is important, is the upper bolt for the hat that goes on the upper mount of the shock or the strut assembly. That bolt needs to be tightened down prior to putting it on the vehicle. And this is kind of annoying because technically you're supposed to tighten that bolt with load on that bushing. So what I did to try and account for this is I tried to estimate the angle it would be sitting at when the vehicle was sitting down, and then I tightened that bolt. Unfortunately, there's like really no way around this. So if you really wanted, you could like put it together, set the vehicle down, note that angle, and then loosen everything back up, put it back on jacks, and then tighten that bolt. For some setups, I think that hat probably has more accessible points, but at least for this setup, I couldn't get it oriented in a way where I could easily then get at that bolt. So I don't know, maybe there's a way to do this, or maybe I could drill a hole through the hat and then it wouldn't cause any problems and I could loosen and tighten it. But I kind of want to keep that hat as structural as possible, so I didn't drill any holes. We'll see, maybe there's a better way to address that in the future. Okay, so where have we gotten to so far? Basically, everything is good to go now. We're ready to put CV axles and spindles back on. I'm going to talk a little bit about some options that you can consider from this point on. So I ended up replacing my hubs, and I've got new wheels, and so there's other things to kind of factor in here when you're trying to finish off this kit. So I'm going to address all that in the next video because this video is already getting pretty long, but I appreciate all your support. Thanks for watching. We've got more videos in the pipeline here, trying to kick them out as fast as I can. Fun fact too, I don't know if you caught the little Easter egg, but my front four-wheel drive broke, and maybe some of my transfer case too. So I've got a video coming on that as well. I ended up replacing that front actuator while I was doing these seals because the diff was fully drained. So video coming on that, and stay tuned. So, all right, well, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate all your support. I'll catch you all in the next video.